Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of Cognitive Dissidents. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me for our last weekly chat of the year is our Chief Investment Officer, Rob Larity. I think this will be the second to last episode that we publish this year. We'll have one more podcast episode that'll go out. I'm not sure if it'll be next Monday or before the new year, but it'll come out before the end of the year, and then we will take sort of a short pause and hiatus here before getting back into our normal cadence. But stick with us. I think that 2023 is going to be a great year for the podcast. We've got a lot of other great guests and things planned for you. Also, a hearty thank you to the listeners. We've crossed 100 reviews here on December the 22nd, so thank you so much for your help. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being here. I really appreciate it. Whatever you're celebrating at this time of year, I hope it's good. Stay safe. Cheers. See you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. All right, last podcast of the year, Rob. You ready?
I'm ready to go.
How was your week last week?
You know, usually I really like this time of year because everyone is very quiet. You don't have to do a lot of calls. You know, you can get work done on your own pace and speed. But frankly, it's been a total nightmare the last 2 weeks and very, very busy and hectic. So it's not my usual seasonal pattern.
But you've been traveling a lot too. You've been back and forth across the Atlantic at least once, right?
Yeah, and that time change, man, going back to Boston and getting tired and ready to go to sleep at like 7:30, it's not easy.
No. Well, we weren't even supposed to record this week because I was supposed to be gone. But last week, I just want to tell listeners something crazy that happened to me last week because whatever. So if you haven't figured it out yet, I'm a super big nerd. My idea of a good time is when Garrison Keillor decides to put together a revival of A Prairie Home Companion. I'm going to go to St. Louis and watch a revival of A Prairie Home Companion. So I did that last week with my wife. And lo and behold, it was great. It was wonderful. We were the youngest people in the audience by probably about 40 years. On the way home in the airport, who is walking by in the airport but Garrison Keillor on his way, I guess, to the local coffee shop so that he could have a bite of something to eat. And I hemmed and hawed for 10 minutes. Should I say hello to him? Should I not say hello to him? And I eventually went and said hello to him to thank him for the show. And then he quizzed me for 10 minutes about what I do. And when he heard that I do geopolitics for a living, he started quizzing me about Russia and Ukraine. So somehow last Friday, I was in the St. Louis airport talking to Garrison Keillor about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It was a really special moment for me. You probably all don't care, but I thought I'd share it.
It sounds like a hallucination.
It was. It felt kind of like a hallucination. I'm still not actually convinced that it actually happened. Anyway, we're off topic. Let's get back into
way off.
It's that time of year. We're chilling. But
let's talk about Japanese monetary policy.
Yes, let's talk about Japanese monetary policy because the Bank of Japan. This week, everybody apparently is an expert on the Bank of Japan and the yen. It's been interesting to see all the people coming out talking about what this means. But why don't you lay the groundwork for the listeners, Rob, and tell the listeners what the Bank of Japan did this week.
Well, it's funny that everyone is talking about it. I think it's partly a result of that it's such a slow news week. And in part, that's the Bank of Japan and Kuroda's intention is to give us a little surprise during a period when everyone's sort of checked out and liquidity isn't very good and you're going to move markets a little bit more than you would otherwise. But here are the issues and here's the debate around the issues. So the Bank of Japan has a monetary policy called yield curve control, where they essentially have anchored bond yields at a certain level as a stimulus measure. And the bank had been expressing, concern for a long time because you're essentially fixing the price of bonds, which means that not a lot of trading is going to happen at that price because it's not the real price that people would want to pay. So liquidity in the Japanese government bond market had been drying up, and there was basically no transactions happening. And they had been signaling, that this was problematic because you can't transmit monetary policy if no one's buying and selling the bonds. So what they did was everyone expected them to come out in their meeting earlier this week and basically say nothing. Kuroda is leaving in the spring. Everyone's focused on how is he going to set the table for his successor. He's not going to do anything crazy, et cetera, et cetera. And what he did was he came out and he changed the yield curve control policy to say, okay, well, instead of pinning yields at 25 basis points, 0.25% on the 10-year Japanese government bond yield, we're going to expand the band up to 0.5%. Now that sounds very dry and very technical, and it is. It's super boring, and everyone freaked out. It's been all over the news. That's, exploded the financial system, apparently. And really, the debate is, was this just a technical change? Or, as everyone has been anticipating and hoping for and betting on, is the Bank of Japan throwing in the towel and they're going to have to follow the Fed higher because they can't put up with the inflation they're experiencing, and, they're going to give up on yield curve control and give up on their stimulus policies. So that's the debate, was he trying to give the tiniest little, thin edge of the wedge, I'm not saying that correctly, but you know what I mean, to something much bigger in terms of change? Or was it him just tinkering? And that's what people are fighting about right now on both sides.
Well, and I feel like there's also been an even bigger thing on not just is this the end of is it Abenomics? Abeonomics? I don't know I've never actually tried to pronounce that phrase, but Japan's easy monetary policy that began under Abe. But if you want Axios, I'm looking at this, I'll pick on Axios here for a second, but you can pick the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg. They all have this, they put out a piece that said what the Bank of Japan's surprise means for the world. And they talk about how this is the end of easy monetary policy in general. Decades of easy monetary policy are over. The Japanese, the last holdouts, have thrown in the towel. And to your point, we went from 25 basis points to 50 basis points. It doesn't really make sense. It also, and I mean, this is the thing I've been saying too, I feel like there's also an in-between here, which is that Japan has been trying to drive inflation now for decades. They've been failing at it, but they finally have inflation above 2%. I think the last reading was 3.6 or 3.7% in October. Okay, so maybe they want to get inflation into the Goldilocks level. The Bank of Japan seems to be doing its own thing, and everybody else is intuiting this big shift as a result of what the Bank of Japan is doing. And I just don't think that makes sense. I think that makes sense in the old world where everybody's pulling in the same direction. But in our new multipolar world, you're going to have different monetary policies among the different major powers in the world. Get used to it.
The sort of breathless commentary about, this is the massive change in Japanese policy and marks the end of, the last 10 years, or really, Kuroda has been around for 10 years, but the policy has been around for much longer than that, 20 years. The notion that is the end, I think, is just total freaking nonsense in plain English. And, I'm not a Japan expert, and some of our listeners are, so I really invite them to call in and point out where we're wrong. I'm a generalist with a deep interest in Japan, in Japanese monetary policy and history and stuff. So I guess the way that I would approach this is look at what they're saying. Look at what they've been saying for years and years about what they want to do. And you have to couch that in, your area, which is the geopolitical situation of Japan. Where do they find themselves? What do they want to accomplish with this? And I think the mistake that sort of the breathless people are making here is they're misunderstanding what they want to achieve, and they're applying the situation or the mental models of the United States Fed or the ECB even, which, really the Fed, to the Japanese situation. And I don't think that's correct. And it's not speculation. What I would encourage people to do who are interested in this is go to the Bank of Japan's website. There's a speech that was published, which I think is really interesting. It's by one of the board members named Nakamura, and it was given on December 7th to a business group in Nagano, Japan.
December 7th, huh?
December 7th. No comment. Laying a surprise on them.
Yeah.
And you really got to read this speech because it lays out exactly the line that I think they believe and what they're trying to accomplish. And just to take a few of the key points from this speech, this guy Nakamura in this speech says, basically, I have no concerns about inflation in Japan. There is no wage price spiral. There's no evidence of that. And that's in many ways what we want. He points out the differences between services inflation in Japan and in, the United States and Europe, wage and labor cost inflation in Japan versus US and Europe. And, they're not getting it. And that's what they want. We've spoken about a few weeks ago how nominal wage growth in Japan is finally starting to pick up to levels that we haven't seen in 20 years, in part because of this inflationary push. That's what they want. That's what they want. And it's not just academic, because if you read this speech, he explains why they want that. And he points out, I'm just paraphrasing here, that if you look at Japanese corporate behavior over the last 30 years, when they've been in the deflationary trap, it's been a behavior of defensiveness and caution. Cost cutting, pulling back on investment at the first sign of any trouble, reducing employment, reducing wages, refusing to hire, not investing in people. And you have this sort of zombie economy as a result that's sort of stagnated in terms of technological productivity growth, things like that. Japan was at the cutting edge of everything 30 years ago, and now they're not, with some obvious and very big exceptions. So what Nakamura says in the speech is, we want to create an environment where Japanese corporates are going to be investing in human capital. We need human capital deepening. We need to create this sort of self-reinforcing spiral where they feel like, oh shit, we better pay these people. We need to feel there's a scarcity of labor, that there's a scarcity of talent, and we want to invest in people so that they develop their skills, so that wage growth, sort of like they want to create a Henry Ford environment, pay them $5 an hour, and they're gonna kick ass. And they're not there right now, but that's clearly the goal that they're going for. And I don't see anyone discussing that. No one's reading these speeches. Am I the only nerd who actually goes to the website and pulls down the PDF and reads these things?
Yes.
Because they tell you exactly what they're going to do.
Well, and there are cases where central bank officials or politicians will tell you things that you shouldn't actually listen to them because they're trying to spin a narrative or something like that. But I think what you're saying is that what he's saying in that speech reflects what Japan is actually doing. There's no subtlety or deception there about what Japan is trying to do. They've actually been fairly blunt and open about what they're trying to do. It might not work. I think that's the kind of the bigger question here about whether it's going to work or not. But I think you're right that the way that people are framing this is they're just framing Japan as a small part of this interminable discussion about the Fed pivot and what's going on with the US dollar. Well,
it's the easy way to encapsulate it. Oh, the Fed is pivoting. Oh, the DOJ is pivoting. It's a very shorthand way to try to summarize everything if you don't want to take the time.
Well, and to be fair, that's how things worked for the last 30 years. For the last 30 years, I'm stealing this point from you now. Monetary policy globally generally moved in the same direction over the last 30 years. There were differences in degrees and differences in timing and things like that. But in general, most economies were moving in the same direction. They had the same definitions of success. Everybody was trying to do the same thing. And that's just not true anymore. What Japan is trying to do is not what the United States is trying to do, is not what Europe is trying to do, is not what China is trying to do. Everybody has their own thing. And as central banks Central banks ultimately represent their own countries. Like central bankers also have relationships between themselves, and in some ways, central bankers understand, I think, other central bankers better than they understand, like, the average Joe Schmo in their own country. But like a central bank, like the Bank of Japan is still the Bank of Japan. Like it's supposed to do what's right by Japan for Japanese people. So if you want to understand like what they're doing, it's important to see what they're saying and what their policies are kind of going for.
And other than, I don't want to get too deep into history and stuff, but I think it's worth pointing out sort of the Japanese mindset around, what are their priorities? And I think you can't ignore the almost existential dread that the Japanese feel and have felt for a significant amount of time throughout their entire history. They're this little island clinging to the side of China with no resources, and they need to survive.
Yeah. And you're right. Like the government has also gone from a defensive posture to an aggressive posture. Like it's like things are definitely changing in Japan, and the monetary policy discussion, I think, is part of that. Is there anything else we should say about Japan before we kind of take a step back and think about last year and the year that's in front of us?
No, I don't think so. We can
get off our soapboxes there. So before we take a step back and sort of think about what's going to happen next year, I thought it was worth just kind of taking stock of the year before us. And I've sort of said this on the podcast before, but I if you and I, because we weren't podcasting at this time last year, I don't think you and I started podcasting together on the weekly cadence until April. But I don't, like, if we had been talking about Russia, Ukraine in December 2021, we would have been talking about how I didn't think Russia was going to invade, and that this was all sort of a political thing, and that there were other places to look at in the world that were more important. And I guess that's just a good lesson for thinking about forecasting, which is you can, what seems unthinkable here today is probably not going to be unthinkable in the next year ahead. And in some ways, that's the hardest part about forecasting, because you don't want to say things that have no basis in fact, because then you're just like a shock jock and you're trying to get clicks. But at the same time, you have to say things that, or think about things that seem unrealistic, to the point that people might think you're actually nuts, and you have to be alone in that position until suddenly sort of events change with you. And I didn't do a good job of that last year. I sort of didn't have my finger on the pulse of what was going on last year. I was going to ask you, Rob, like what, and I guess maybe the Russia-Ukraine war also colors your perception of this, but from an investment perspective, like what would we have been talking about on your end in December 2021 if we were getting ready for 2022? And how do you think the year, like what was the biggest surprise of the year to you? Is it the Russia-Ukraine thing, or was there something else in the investment sphere that had a bigger change, if that question makes sense?
It's funny because I think it's in Philip Tetlock's work where people are really bad, he points out, at looking back and realizing, unless they keep a journal of some kind, what they would have thought or said about a topic, in hindsight, because you're inevitably so colored by what's gone on. So I think it's a tricky question to answer. I guess maybe the way to start about it is, as far as investments and markets go, what was not a surprise. And the fact that it was not a surprise, I guess, was a little surprising. And that was the behavior of just the meme stock bubble, the sort of crypto mania, everything that we experienced in 2021. That almost felt like, history repeating itself as farce in some ways, because it wasn't that long ago that we were experiencing the tech bubble, which was having many of the same characteristics. That was a surprise. Usually it takes a very long time in between bubbles like that. But we had one in a 20-year span, which is weird. And I think worth thinking about, is there something structurally contributing to that? Like, our memory's shorter? Does information just move faster? Is there something making bubbles more likely in the financial system right now? And, the obvious answer would be low interest rates and stuff like that. But I don't know. I don't have the answer to that, but it's worth pondering over.
But so I wanted to lead in with that just to say that in some ways, like I've put together some of my thoughts on 2023, and this will go out to readers of the Global Situation Report. So if you haven't read it, you might want to get signed up for it. But in some ways, what makes me most uncomfortable about what the thoughts I've put together is there's nothing here that really feels like that sort of Russia-Ukraine thing. You know, I feel like all the things that I have in front of me for 2023 are well known and are sort of already out there. And I don't feel like I'm anticipating the other shoe kind of dropping. But I will say that sort of at a larger perspective, I think in some ways the specific forecasts or the specific scenarios are less important. The one that I keep going back to is getting the most macro insight right possible, which is, are we in a unipolar world? Are we in a bipolar world? Or are we in a multipolar world? Unipolar just means United States still the most dominant power in the world. Bipolar would be, hey, we're heading towards another Cold War. It's just instead of the Soviet Union, it's going to be China, and the United States is a very dominant power, and China is a very dominant power, and those are the types of dynamics that are going to govern things. Or are we really moving towards multipolarity, where there are multiple power centers, multiple economic poles in the world that are actually exerting influence on each other? And I think that's the thing I'm most concerned about getting right, because the most important insight I think you would have needed geopolitically over the last 30 years was unipolar world. The United States is the most powerful thing. It's all going to come back down to that. And it's going to be boring, but like you just have to repeat that over and over again and not get distracted by the shiny objects because the United States was still top dog. And I think where I've kind of landed is I think we're still in a unipolar world. I think in some ways, like 2022 has shown us that the United States is still the most powerful country in the world. When the United States decides that it wants to crack down on Chinese tech, it will crack down on Chinese tech and it will wipe out Chinese companies or make it really, really difficult for the Chinese economy to do things that it wants to do. And there's no military challenger really to the United States that wants to try them. The only one that emerged was Russia trying to go into Ukraine, and Russia got embarrassed. It's getting its ass whooped by Ukrainians using American weapons like all over Eastern Europe. So I think in some ways we're still in the unipolar moment, but I think the trajectory really is towards multipolarity, even if I think in 2023 it's going to feel more unipolar than multipolar. Like if you listen to me talk, if you've seen me in a speech, or if you read my writing, if you listen to the podcast, you know I think we're headed towards a multipolar world. But in some ways, I almost want to pull the reins back a little bit and say, hey, just because I think that's the trajectory towards the end of the decade. Like 2023, it seems to me that the United States is actually going to be able to do a lot of things. Like Russia's completely distracted and losing a war. China's completely distracted with an economic crisis. The United States is using its leverage on an economic level and on a tech level to punish powers that it thinks are against it. It's still able to, what some of the unrest that we're seeing in Iran right now goes right back to the United States sanction regime against Iran. Like you can sort of put all those things together and it actually still looks like a world that is dominated by the United States. And in some ways, like we might even see more of that in the coming year because the Democrats don't have the House. And when a U.S. president doesn't have Congress to fall back on, he usually starts making noise in foreign policy. And I wonder if Biden's going to start making noise in foreign policy and if we're actually going to see 2023 be sort of a last gasp of the unipolar moment. So that I think is the most important thing to sort of keep in mind. And in some ways it flies in the face of my usual talking points here. And we can talk about the rest if you want, but I'll just throw that to you and maybe ask you to pick at it, Rob, or maybe you think it makes sense. I don't know.
I guess the only thing I would add to it, not really to pick at it, but just sort of take it from a different angle, which is more of a financial or economic angle, is I don't think you should be surprised at the fact that China's getting smacked in this series of events, because if you look historically, the big current account surplus countries are always the ones that are vulnerable when things start to break down. They are the ones who have benefited the most from the unipolar environment or, whatever, latching themselves to some hegemon, because by definition, that is the source of demand for their exports. And yet, at the same time, they're also the most exposed when that turns around because they're dependent to sell into that market. And the US played that role in the 1920s, and they got hit, arguably in many ways, the worst of all when the Depression came and the barriers went up, because they were exporting to the rest of the world. America was the China of 1928. So that sort of matches with history. And I don't think China's going to be able to avoid that pain very easily, as we're seeing right now. The other thing that I would just think is, in terms of unipolar versus multipolar, right? Like the hegemon or the unipolar, dominant country, typically in a financial sense or an economic sense, has to incur some burden to support the global system that they're dominating, right? So in the US's case, we allow the dollar to be used as the world's reserve currency. We incurred serious and significant costs to, ensure the peaceful commerce and trade routes that aren't infested with pirates and war and stuff like that. But the monetary one is really the interesting one because, and again, this is like a balance of payments thing. But the fact that we've allowed first the Japanese and then the Chinese, and more recently, Taiwanese life insurers and, everyone under the sun who wants to accumulate huge surpluses to export their capital into the US without restriction. The US capital markets are the deepest and most liquid markets in the world. And there's nothing remotely as liquid or huge as the US Treasury market. And we've incurred a cost because the US dollar is much stronger than it otherwise would be because of that, because people want to hold dollars, right? And everyone's been speculating for a long time that at some point, the US is going to get disgusted with the implications of that. And the implications of that are we run deficits forever, right? Remember when we started, becoming self-sufficient in oil, and people thought, oh, well, all those big deficits are going to go away now. Well, the deficits are bigger than they've ever been.
Yeah.
So it clearly wasn't that. And that's why I think, the Inflation Reduction Act is a very interesting series of events, and the European response to it, because there's a lot of ways that you can make that adjustment. And it's always been sort of weird to think that the US was going to go out and say, we want the dollar to be weaker. Like, they're just not going to do that. Even if they understand the issues, that's just not plausible that the Treasury Secretary is going to call for a weak dollar, because everyone will freak out, first of all. Like, the financial system will really not take that well. And it just expresses weakness, right? But another way that you can make that same adjustment is by giving other kinds of subsidies to domestic producers to even the playing field. China does this all the time. Chinese companies have enormous implicit subsidies, suppressed cost of capital, all kinds of things that they benefit from, which isn't necessarily, oh, we're just controlling the exchange rate on the currency.
Yeah.
So that seems to be a sign, that you are moving, like, that's not the US doing something for the world or incurring some costs for the world. That's us looking out for us. And that's a big change. Like, we haven't really seen that, at least not remotely to this extent or scale that we're seeing it now. And I think that's a pretty strong data point in support of your notion that unipolarity is done.
Well, yeah, it's a subtle point that you're making, but I think it is true. Like, I think the United States has always done what is in its interests. But I think what's changed now is that the United States felt that what was in its interest was also for a larger international order that it was a part of. And that order and United States interests were melded together. And there were differences between the different parties and between different presidents, like how you express that. But in general, if the order was maintained, that was good for the United States, even if it meant, some problems in the United States as a result. I think what you're pointing out is, even though the United States is the dominant economy, it's the dominant military power, it is in all these ways unipolar. In some ways, it has globalization remorse. Like, we're going away from this idea that the order and U.S. interests are exactly the same. It's actually, and this is true of Biden and Trump. I mean, Trump did the Make America Great thing, right? But Biden's doing the same thing. This new industrial policy is make America great again. It's just make things great in America again or something like that. But it's the same sort of policy. And for the United States, it's less about we're going to build this order, and the stronger the order is, the better it is for the United States. It's more about, no, we're going to make the United States strong. And then once the United States is strong, maybe we can defend the order, or we can punish people who don't do things that are in the best interest of the United States. And that's what makes me say the trajectory is towards multipolar, because you sort of talked about how China's playing the role of the United States in the 1920s. We're playing the role of the British Empire. We are thinking that because we have all this leverage and because we have this power and this history of exercising this power in a way that is good for the order, that we can just make a decision like that and everybody's going to follow along. And I just don't think it's going to happen. And it's going to happen in like very subtle ways. Like one example I wanted to bring up from the last year, I think one of our best calls this year in general has been about Turkey, because we've done the hard work of trying to understand Turkey rather than thinking about it through an ideological lens. If you look at lira deposits, Turkish lira deposits, they made up 35% of all savings in the Turkish banking system around this time last year. It's half today. So from 35% to 50%. That's small. It's not going to change the balance of power globally, geopolitically, but it also tells you, hey, Turkey's one of these countries that understands what the United States is doing and now wants to do things for itself. And it's trying to de-dollarize and increase the power of its own currency and its own control over its own monetary system. Now, as I've always said, Erdogan might fail. He might actually be bounced out of office later in 2023 as a result of his policies. But it's those small signals like that where parts of the order are saying, hey, like, the United States is not concerned about us anymore. The United States is concerned about the United States, and we will emulate the United States in that. We will take care of our own. And it's that sort of world that's emerging, even as the vestiges of the past are still there. And the ironic thing is, and I've been saying this for a while too, there's so much doom and gloom out there. Like, you can see, like we were talking about the Bank of Japan and the yen earlier. Just look at the stories. It's all like, oh my God, the sky is crashing. Like, I think these are the good times. I think when we look back in history, like, these will be the years that we like wish we could go back to and figure out how to enjoy them a little bit better, because this trajectory sucks a decade down the road, but it means that now is the time where we should get tech innovation and where the old vestiges of the order and stability are still in the system before we make the big transitions to things that are less certain and involve less change. So I don't know. I keep feeling that too.
Well, I think it's a source of worry and optimism. Worry for the obvious reasons that you just pointed out, but optimism also because, I mean, if you look at the world now, the inequality between nations is enormous. And, a large bulk of humanity is sort of stuck in a lower level of development. And that's just bad. And what is going to get them out of that? In some ways, fear is good. In some ways, saying, oh shit, we can't depend on the empire anymore is a good catalyst in some ways, because those are the only examples we have of large countries that attained developed world status in a short amount of time, was they totally went on their own. And I feel like I talk about the East Asian, development miracle in every podcast that we do. But my God, what an extraordinary series of events it was. And, I think that the silver lining of this move toward multipolarity that you point out is that more countries are going to realize, like Turkey, like, hey, we're in this alone. Like, the benefits of this system no longer outweigh the costs, and we have to figure this out for ourselves. And that applies to a lot of countries in Africa. We've talked about and you've talked about specifically sort of this notion of moving away from cash crops for global markets and boosting self-sufficiency. And I'm not sure if there's much evidence of that, but you can certainly see the environment for that being more amenable in the next 10 years than it was in the last 10 years. And ultimately, that's a good thing.
Maybe, but I mean, this is a good topic to kind of get into a little bit, because generally the places that suffer the most in these multipolar eras are the in-between places that can't stand on their own 2 feet. So on paper, it makes perfect sense. Right after the pandemic, I put out major forces, geopolitical forces of the 2020s, and one of them was African agriculture. And if you look at African agriculture, They're like Africa as a continent. It has the most I think untended arable land left in the world. It has some of the worst productivity in the world because they're not using modern technology in lots of different ways. And to the extent that they are growing things, to your point, they're growing things like coffee. So, they're having to import large amounts of grains so that their farmers can make not a lot of money selling cacao or coffee or things like that. And it should be a pretty easy fix. Like just get some technology into the system and like revamp your agricultural sector, and things should be fine. It's easy to sort of do on paper, but it doesn't work. None of it actually gets applied in real time. I sent around an article to our research team that was in The Guardian, a week or two ago. 90% of Tanzanian households use charcoal or firewood to cook as a result of high natural gas prices this year. Like, we think we've come so far as a society because we have iPhones and this, that, or the other thing. Like, in parts of Africa, they're still burning wood to literally heat like their homes. Like, those places that have not achieved a certain level of power or stability or economic development, it's highly doubtful they're going to achieve it in this kind of environment. Because, globalization was the tide that lifts all boats. Like, deglobalization is the opposite of that. Like, not all the boats are going to get lifted in that system.
Yeah, I think a lot of the boats will be capsized, and some of the ones that aren't capsized will find their way through rough waters, I suppose. It's funny though when you think about it. Like, the U.S. is such a weird superpower, a global hegemon. Like, why on earth would we be a global hegemon? We're far away from everything else. We don't have a particularly high percentage of trade as far as, total GDP or economic growth. We're pretty self-sufficient in terms of resources and materials. Like, where is the incentive to incur huge costs to support the rest of the world? Like, we don't speak a lot of languages. We're just not in the world, like literally geographically in many ways, right?
Well, and even ideologically, our founding myth is a revolt against the global hegemon who kept on telling us what to do, and we didn't want to be told what to do. The United States never wanted any of this for itself. And I think the problem is that unwillingness has turned into willful ignorance today. Like, we didn't want to be the global empire, but when World War II happened and threatened U.S. interests in a material way, like Japan attacks Pearl Harbor, it's a real attack now, an existential attack on the United States. The first since the War of 1812 or something like that. And in response to that, the United States becomes this global power, but it doesn't want to be. Everything in the United States makes the United States want to isolate itself, but because of World War II and then because of the Cold War afterwards, we become this unwilling empire. And somehow it winning the Cold War, I guess, it allowed us to be provincial in the sense that we thought that our values were better than everybody else's. So we just expect everybody to start emulating the United States. So it's this, to your point, it's this confidence that we have the best system and that everybody should use it, but then not wanting to actually make the hard choices that allow those things to be spread around the world. I don't know. I'm now doing psychoanalysis of the United States, which is probably not useful. But I think the reason the United States is so weird is because we have never really, since the 19th century, had a leader that stood up and said, yes, the United States wants to conquer. The United States wants to be the dominant power. We want to be the ones that call the shots. Like, I guess if you go to the 1850s and like President Polk and, taking over parts of Mexico, like that was manifest destiny. That was probably the last time like a U.S. president was actually like, no. Like, we want to be the top dogs. We want to be the ones who are calling the shots. We don't want to do that rhetorically, but then we also want the system to kind of benefit us. So I think it's somewhere in that area that the United States, I think that's the source of its weirdness. Like, the British Empire was a global empire. They knew they were a global empire. They wanted to be an empire. They glorified the empire. We hate the empire. We want to pretend like we don't have the empire, and we'll lose it, I guess, because of that.
I guess it's ironic because I would imagine that a successful empire has to be very inclusive by culture and nature, right? And I think the United States is in some deep way, in the sense that anyone can become American very easily. It's more of a value system. It's more of a, bring in people from other parts of the world. They assimilate, in ways that other countries just doesn't exist. Like, here in France, everything is about, are you French? Like, I could live here for 30 years. I'll never be French. Never, ever, ever. I could come from, Zimbabwe and move to the United States. In 7 years, I'm pretty American, That's the big difference, is what other nation can play that role without having their identity and sort of inclusion be based on a shared history, a shared language, shared cultural customs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, the only countries that can do that are the ones that all of their natives died when European colonists got there. So it's really the United States, Canada, Australia.
So Australia is going to take over the world next?
No, but they have, they can integrate people well into their societies. I don't know if that means that the United States is inclusive, though. Like, the United States also has a very clear, like, either do this or you're not with us sort of element to it as well. But the reason it doesn't work in a place like France or in a place like China is because, the United States was literally starting from scratch. Like, we killed everyone here in this country that would have been here and the ones that survived got put on reservations that, nobody actually pays attention to, and they're still shortchanging them, right? So that didn't happen in France. That didn't happen in China. You have populations going back there hundreds, if not thousands of years, with ties to the land and linguistic ties and family ties and things like that. And that just didn't happen in the United States or in some of those island countries where I guess the New World, it's the affliction of the New World, right?
Yeah.
And it didn't happen in South America because, I guess those colonists married into the system, or because they were there was more resistance, I think, to some of those diseases. They also imported and integrated lots of African slave labor. So, that's why Brazil is such an interesting society. It really does. It's a true melting pot in that sense. Whereas I guess the United States is a melting pot too. I don't know, but now I'm just rambling a little bit. But I think the only point I was trying to make there is that I think the United States is a little bit different because we didn't integrate the natives or those other things at an early time. Whereas like countries like Brazil, countries even like Mexico, that's still part of their sort of emerging as modern nations. Whereas we already have gone through that emerging in some.
It's funny because I had dinner when I was in Boston with a few friends of ours who are on our upcoming Innovation Advisory Board, which we can talk about another time in 2023 when we're getting into that. But the topic of conversation was sort of shared memory. So these guys, one of them is the, Mexican heritage, and another one is another American guy. But we were talking about the notion that I said, it's funny because my whole adult life, it feels like, talking about this shift from unipolarity to multipolarity. Like I turned 18 in the year 2001, and it was my first week of college when the Twin Towers went down, right? So welcome to adulthood. And I think that, I like the notion of thinking that my generation is the last one to have kind of grown up in that peak and then experienced sort of the hinge from, oh my God, things were so good that, the whole story of Fight Club was, we're so bored, we're going to beat the shit out of each other, Yeah. No, seriously. Like we have no great war. Our war is, against catalog shopping. And that was the zeitgeist, right? And like The Matrix, we've recreated 1999 because it was the height of your civilization. Like, yeah, in some ways it was. But at the dinner, I was explaining this and saying, progressively things have just been sort of this movement away from that, starting with the 2001 and the war on terror and the financial crisis. It's just been one shit show after another, Jacob. And, a period of disillusionment. And these guys pointed out that like, that's such a uniquely American viewpoint. Because if you were to ask someone, a young person my age in China, they would be like, oh my God, things have been absolutely great. Like, what a boom period. It's just been up the whole time. And then, our friend who's from Mexico said, things were actually really good. And then in 2010-11, he remembers that was the time when they all realized that the cartel violence had had flipped some kind of switch, and they were always, troublesome, but like things were never going to be the same again. So like you see these different timelines and periods of memory that don't match up. And I bring that up as, I know I'm rambling, but I was just thinking about 2023 and what the big things that we're focused on are that are different and a little bit outside of what everyone's talking about is I'm really concerned about China. And I think it's really underestimated the risks of what's going on there, both from an economic standpoint, but also getting to this memory standpoint. People's expectations are very high. And if you look at the work of Benjamin Friedman, for example, who wrote a book about this in the United States, in periods when people see themselves doing worse than their parents or facing bigger challenges or having lower expectations than the generation before, it creates all these unknowns. You have social problems, you have violence, you have drug abuse, you have all of the bad stuff that happens when people lose hope in some sense, when they, have a higher discount rate on the future, if you want to use it in financial terms. All of that starts to spring up. And I just really worry about how they're going to thread the needle with all of this and keep people happy.
Yeah. And just, to give a sneak peek of the forecast document, I won't say it all here, but China's a big one, but there are other countries that have those same sorts of fears. Like Iran and Turkey are squarely on the list for focus in the year ahead. We've already talked about Japan. Both Japan and the European Union, you actually might have the reverse. You might have a generation that thinks they can have it better than their parents. Like maybe one of the key indicators we're looking for here, the countries that will do well are the ones where you can actually think, hey, actually, we are the generation that's emerging from the lost decades or whatever else. And there's the collapse of Russia too. But I won't step on the forecast document. How about we leave it there? If you haven't signed up for the Global Sit Rep, you should. And otherwise, we'll take a break until 2023.
Sounds good.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidents podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.